circus is leaving town tonight. Their train will go right through here. When it does, you just follow me. You run with all your might, and when you grab on, grab tight.
Don't you worry about me, Sam.
Shh, be quiet.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Neil Gregory, who is the Chief Thought Leadership Officer of the International Finance Corporation, which is the private investment arm of the World Bank Group. Neil, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
So Neil, first tell us about your role at IFC and what it actually involves as it pertains to what we're going to be talking about around operating principles.
So IFC is one of the largest investors in emerging markets. And increasingly, as people realize the importance of private capital in solving the world's biggest global development challenges, they want to hear from IFC about our experience of what works in attracting private capital into those markets and private sector solutions to climate change, to poverty, to inequality, and other social challenges. And so that's really my role, is to tap into the collective experience and insights of all our investment teams and share that with the various stakeholders who are interested, try and shape the global conversation about how to tackle the big social challenges we face.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. Can you tell us about this operating principles for impact management and specifically the 9 principles within that?
So one of the things that we heard a lot when we talked to asset owners and large investors about what it would take for them to put their capital to work, having a positive impact on the world, was that they were confused by all these different labels of sustainability and SDG and ESG and all these different labels people were putting on funds, which in some way were supposed to make a positive impact on the world. And they told us, look, we want to understand, what do I actually get for my money? If I put my money into a sustainable fund or an impact fund, what is that fund manager going to do differently with that money in order to achieve impact? And so that led us to develop 9 principles called the operating principles for impact management, which really go through how you integrate having an objective of having a positive impact alongside having an investment objective of earning a positive financial return at all stages of the project cycle. And these principles have now been adopted by over 100 investors around the world, large and small, managing nearly $500 billion of capital.
That's incredible progress since we last spoke. Can you explain, in the sense of, you explain what the operating principles are, but what it is not in the context of, I guess what I'm getting at is, there are other standards that are out there, the HIPSO and the IRIS Plus as an example, that I think works more in conjunction. But what is it that what are the kind of deliverables that you look for, but also how is it different from some of these other models that are out there that's more at the forensics or accounting level?
Sure. So it's a confusing space, and there are lots of different standards and frameworks out there. I think the first thing to distinguish is between ESG investing, which is really about managing environmental and social risks to improve your financial performance. And there, the global standard for complying with that approach is the UN Principles for Responsible Investing that many people may be familiar with. There's about $80 trillion aligned with those principles. So what the operating principles for impact management do is go one step further beyond those principles and say, what more do you need to do beyond just managing ESG risk if you want to have a positive impact with your portfolio. And so they're really set at the level of principles which speak to the process by which you manage your investment portfolio. Now, once you get into that process, you realize part of what you have to do is to measure and monitor and report on the impact you're having. And that's where the sets of impact indicators that you mentioned, like IRIS Plus and HIPSO, come in. And there's a lot of activity at the moment trying to harmonize the various impact indicators. So the operating principles don't tell you which indicators to use, they tell you how you should integrate that impact measurement into your portfolio management and reporting process, and then you can use one of these other frameworks to actually select the relevant metrics.
I think that's very helpful to understand. Can you tell us how these principles fill a credibility integrity gap?
Sure. So for many asset owners, investors wanting to put their money into impact funds, it's very much a black box. These funds, a lot of them are very new, they don't have much of a track record, and you don't really know how they're going to manage your money or what you're going to get in terms of impact. So the principles introduce a level of transparency and discipline that was lacking before, and they do this in two ways. Firstly, any institution that signs up to the principles commits to making a public disclosure each year where they describe their impact management system. So for any of the 100+ signatories, you can go to the Impact Principles website and read those disclosure statements. And so for the first time, you can actually understand how they manage your money for impact. And the second way it does this is by requiring signatories to every year or two to get an independent third-party verification, which actually takes a look at what the fund manager or the institution is doing and provides a verification and assurance that, yes, they do actually do the things that they describe in their disclosure statement. So with these two things, for the first time, investors both can understand how their money is being managed and have some assurance that their money is being managed consistently in accordance with the principles.
And I'm curious, I know that, again, since we last spoke, there's been a lot more signatories that's come on board and really representing a very significant amount of capital that's out there. How are they perceiving it? Are they perceiving most welcoming it in the sense that this is something that is in line with their mission and values, as well as their constituency, their ultimately impact investors are looking for? Or some viewing it as effectively another form of compliance or self-regulation?
So we've seen a lot of positive response since we launched the principles. I think that for asset managers and institutions managing money for impact, they find it helpful in a couple of ways. One is that it provides a very clear signal to investors and potential investors that they are following good practices and a good discipline in impact management and measurement in a market where there's a lot of new entrants coming in and a lot of questions about who's credible in this space. I think people are really looking for the ability to signal that they are a credible and disciplined investor for impact. And secondly, people have found a lot of value in becoming a signatory because then they become part of what's really become a nice learning community amongst the signatories. Having signed on to the principles, you've all agreed on what you're trying to do for impact management, but then there's still a lot in terms of implementation of figuring out best practices and how to implement the different principles. So we convene regular conversations and webinars and interaction amongst the signatories. We're really learning from each other in how to actually implement the principles. I think this is good for the industry and it's good for each of the signatories.
Yeah, I couldn't concur with you more on that in terms of sharing best practices because, for many of them, I mean, perhaps maybe they've done it somewhat informally, but this is a formalized approach and they're starting to really integrate it across the entire value chain and to increase that transparency and the impact that they're doing. So, being able to actually share across their community of peers, I think is incredible from a time savings as well as the cost savings and best practices. Mm-hmm. Can you share a couple of case studies of these signatories? Have they kind of, one, what are they measuring and how they've actually started to incorporate some of these principles and the successes that they're starting to see as a result?
So So I think one thing you're seeing is that as a result of implementing the principles, many of the signatories are now aligning around a common core set of metrics for indicators that measure impacts on things like gender and things like climate and things like job creation. So we've seen that now something like 2/3 of all the signatories are using a consistent set of metrics. And so I think that's been a real step forward for many of the signatories. When they first adopted the principles, they maybe were each using their own bespoke metrics to measure these things. But once they realized that they were trying to achieve similar impacts to other investors, then there was a process of moving towards a common set of metrics and a lot of discussion between signatories around that. And I think the second thing we're seeing is that funds that have adopted the principles are able to mobilize capital at greater scale and really move up and attract more attention in the impact investing world. And I think one good example of that would be the Leapfrog Fund from which focuses on investing in technology and fintech and financial inclusion across Africa and Asia. And I think they were about a $300 billion fund manager when they adopted the principles. They were one of the first signatories and very involved with us in creating the principles. And in the last few months, they closed an Australian $1 billion fund, which is about $700 million in US dollars. So, a real scale up in their ability to mobilize capital since they adopted the principles. And I think this is something we see and will continue to see amongst many of the fund managers that are now using the principles.
This is very, very exciting. I think going back to your first point about metrics is that, we're starting to see movement away from firm-specific metrics to more industry-standard metrics. And, I think to that end, IFC has played a really critical role in terms of defining exactly what the operating principles are. So from a definition and target, and then now starting to have more standardized measurements and reporting. I think that really starts to allow for that apple to apple comparison, which really I think the market's been lacking. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, I think for those that not have joined the signatories, it almost puts this kind of undue peer pressure in terms of the longer they wait, the more it appears to the market that perhaps maybe there are some transparency issues or something to that extent. So really, I think at some point, and it looks like you guys are definitely hitting the tipping point that more and more of the capital markets are starting to really recognize that this is not just optional, but in some ways obligatory, and will choose to opt in to these principles in the signatory process. Is that right?
Sure. One thing I would highlight about the principles is that because you have to do this public disclosure within 12 months of joining, you really have to be confident that you have your systems in place before you sign the principles. So it's a bit different to some other principles like the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, which have been criticized over the years, that institutions will sign up to them sort of on an aspirational basis and say, well, this is where we'd like to be, but you don't really know whether they've really put the systems in place to comply. And so I think we'd have even more signatories, but for the fact that a lot of investors that we've talked to said, we want to sign the principles, but we know we're not there yet. We have some work to do to put the principles in place. And once we've done that, we're going to come back and sign. What big asset managers are saying, we know we want to launch an impact fund, but first we have to put the systems in place. And then when we're ready to launch, we'll come back and sign. And so we have hundreds more potential signatories in the pipeline. But I think the fact that people are taking the time to make sure they've got all their ducks in a row and actually have the systems in place before they come forward to sign it is a good sign, and is what really makes this a credible signal to the market.
Yeah, I think you point out a really incredibly material aspect, which is that this is not an aspirational principle framework, but that this is something that's going to be really holding them accountable, self-accountable, and peer accountable. Yep. Which, to that end, I guess the question I would have is, what's a role that IFC is playing in terms of the readiness so that they can get to this point of participation, as well as the kind of surge that you're seeing in terms of consultancies that are coming to help address some of these gaps that these signatories, potential signatories.
Yeah, great question. And when we set up these principles, we really wanted to make sure that they were really owned by the industry, and this isn't something that revolves around IFC. So we set up an independent secretariat at arm's length from IFC, fully funded by the registration fees to manage this process. We are very active amongst this community of signatories and sharing our experience, with our impact management system, which, by the way, was recently adopted by JP Morgan when they launched the development finance business. So we're very happy to share our own intellectual property in this space, but we very much want to see the industry own this themselves. And so we've actually been encouraged to see that since the principle has been launched, that a number of consulting firms are offering services to signatories in terms of helping them prepare their disclosure statements, in terms of auditing their internal processes, in terms of doing the independent verification. And so this is what we want to see. We want to build something that's really owned by the industry and is really helping build all the support services and the knowledge that the industry needs to grow and mature.
Well, what I think really stands out is just the deep thought that went into the framework and the methodology and the approach that IFC has taken, and really tried to make sure that it is industry driven versus a regulatory type of a model. And then certainly, like we talked about, this is a accountable that others will see from a reporting and inspection, third party inspection as well. So I think it really it's something that I feel like it has been missing in many ways. You mentioned the UN as an example, but for many years, this concept in different terminology has just been percolating, but now we're actually really starting to hit the road, so to speak. So I'm very, very excited. To that end, in terms of further strengthening the operating principles and to measure its impact, how is your team specifically looking to analyze these disclosure statements and look for areas of convergence or maybe different approaches? We talked about best practices, but also looking for areas of gaps that potentially needs to be addressed.
So one thing which we've done is now we've got I think about 76 disclosures of the first round of disclosures. More continue to come in. We actually read through the first 60 or so that came in and did an analysis which we shared with all the signatories, looking at how comprehensive the disclosures were, where did it seem that there was convergence, where were there areas of divergence, or maybe some areas where best practice hadn't yet formed. And so I think that's been a helpful learning exercise. We learned a lot from it. We shared it in a workshop with the signatories. I think everybody learned a lot from that. As I mentioned, we do see some areas of convergence which are encouraging, particularly around impact measurements. Also around the ESG standards. A lot of signatories are using the IFC performance standards, so quite a lot of convergence there as well. But I think there are still some other areas where we don't yet see consistent practice, and where I think there's more learning and progress to be done. And just to mention one of those, we talk in the principles about the need to align incentives to make sure that your investment teams are motivated to maximize impact as well as financial returns. That's an example of an area where, when you read the disclosure statements, you can see there's not that many organizations which really have done that in a robust way. We reward our investment teams on both impact and financial performance, but as a public organization, we don't pay the big bonuses that private fund managers get. So I'd highlight that as an example of an area where I think we're still at the early stages of developing good practice. But the key point again is that these disclosures are all public. So whether you're an investor or whether you're a CSO or a journalist, anybody wanting to understand where the state of practice is in this industry, you now have much more ability to go directly to the source and find out exactly what each asset manager or institution is doing.
Very exciting. This podcast is specifically oriented towards sustainability and climate change in particular. So as it pertains to the climate crisis, if you were to forecast out the next 10, 20 years, how do you feel that these operating principles will potentially help address, from a mitigation and adaptation side, the climate crisis that we're facing today?
Yeah, and I would very much say 10 years rather than 20 years. I think, there's a great deal of urgency to this. And we spend a lot of time talking to the big asset owners, the pension funds, the insurance companies, the sovereign wealth funds, and so on. And certainly over the last year to 18 months, I would say increasingly we hear from them that they really do want to put more of their capital to work, not just in investments which satisfy their ESG risks. And so obviously they're divesting from coal and other things which are dirty, but they actually want to be part of the climate solution and invest in things which actually have a positive impact to reducing CO2 emissions or helping to adapt to climate impacts. And so what's been missing up until now is the investment opportunities and the clear frameworks and measurements, all the building blocks to enable that capital to flow. So the operating principles are just one piece of those building blocks. I think the work that's been done on measuring climate impacts with TCFD is a second building block. I think we and other investors have a role to play in creating the platforms that will allow these institutional investors to invest at scale, and bridge the gap between these large pools of money and the many small funds and investments opportunities that are out there. So there's various pieces that need to be put in place for this capital to flow, but without a doubt, the capital is there, it's ready to move, and work is moving rapidly, I would say, to build the ecosystem which will enable it to flow. So I'm quite confident. I think progress will accelerate over the next year. I think we're going to see capital increasingly moving at scale into climate opportunities.
Well, I have to say, I have not been this encouraged or hopeful for so long, and I've just really been delighted by this conversation, the progress that you and your team at the IFC have been making in conjunction with the signatories. So with that, I've been joined by Neil Gregory, who is the Chief Thought Leadership Officer at IFC. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Scott. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.